I am one who believes in the sharing of stories. I believe in the process of sharing, period, because I know that all life gets better when you share it. And those thousands of people who have been guests on the show, and many of them who are also audience members, have been my greatest teachers. And I would say that one of my gifts, and it's everybody's job to know what your gift is. So when I talk about my gift, I'm not bragging, it's just fact. It's just a fact. It's a gift. Yes. One of my gifts that I've had since I was a little girl growing up in Mississippi, being raised on a tiny little acre farm with my grandmother, is that I knew how to pay attention. I was a great observer of life. And I grew up believing that I was indeed, for sure, God's child. It's because every Sunday I sat in our little church down the road, a dirt road from where my grandmother lived, no running water, no electricity. I was saying this to my great niece who's 8 the other day, and she said, "It sounds like Little House on the Prairie." And I go, it kind of was. No running water, no electricity, but the church is down the road from us. And we could hear the singing as I was getting dressed for Sunday school. And I'd always sit on the left-hand side, the left pew in the second row. And I would listen to the preacher preach about the Lord thy God is a loving God, and sometimes he would say the Lord thy God is a jealous God. But most important, I heard him say, you are God's child, and through God all things are possible. And I literally took him at his word, so that by the time I was leaving, had to leave my grandmother because she became ill, and I was sent to live in Milwaukee with my mother, who had 2 other children. I got beat up on the playground because when people would ask me, who is your daddy? I would say, Jesus is my daddy. Sometimes he's my brother. And God is my father. But what I now know and have learned, that my view of God, although I call that God in a box, and although that has my vision of God has expanded to be inclusive of all things, all. God is all, God is law, God is all, in all things. Not just the guy sitting up with the beard. And now that view of God has expanded, I still understand how important it was for a little colored girl, we weren't even black yet, not to mention African American, you know what I mean, Harry? A little colored girl in Mississippi for whom there was no vision of hope or possibility. My grandmother's greatest desire for me, as she had been a maid and her mother before her had been a maid, her greatest desire was that I would grow up one day and be able to do the same. And she wished for me that I would be able to. She used to say, I hope you get some good things and treat you good. So my grandmother liked.
And one thing that might be mentioned, Charlie, is that the difference between now and 60 or 70 years ago in the ability of really bright people, really innovative, really energetic people to get finance to do things is just dramatically better than it was at that time. So now, if you've got good ideas, and there's good ideas right in this crowd, and you've got energy, it's far easier to get finance to move forward those ideas than you could 50 or 60 years ago.
Is that because of the internet or crowdsourcing of what is it?
It's just lots more capital around, and people more optimistic about. People are very optimistic about business.
But better ways to connect the two, the capital and those
absolutely.
and the ideas.
It's dramatic.
And the willingness to take risk. The first venture capital stuff is in the 1960s, and it's tiny. Microsoft, when we were taking outside investment. We took at a valuation of $20 million, we took $1 million for 5% of the company.
I'll do it retroactively, folks.
And
You had your chance. You had your chance.
we never spent the money. That is, our business was profitable enough. We really didn't need to do that, but we wanted people on our board to give us advice. And there's an episode of Silicon Valley where all these venture capitalists are courting this guy, and that really reminded me of what it was like. By that time, which was 1984, there were dozens of venture capitalists, and that's something that other countries have tried to duplicate. They have in small part, but not nearly as well. This willingness to take risks, the idea that if you have a failure, it's not a mark of shame, that, hey, what's your next startup going to be?
So why'd I drop out? It started before I was born. My biological mother was a young, unwed graduate student, and she decided to put me up for adoption. She felt very strongly that I should be adopted by college graduates, so everything was all set for me to be adopted at birth by a lawyer and his wife. Except that when I popped out, they decided at the last minute that they really wanted a girl. So my parents, who were on a waiting list, got a call in the middle of the night asking, "We've got an unexpected baby boy. Do you want him?" They said, "Of course." My biological mother found out later that my mother had never graduated from college and that my father had never graduated from high school. She refused to sign the final adoption papers. She only relented a few months later when my parents promised that I would go to college. This was the start in my life. And 17 years later, I did go to college. But I naively chose a college that was almost as expensive as Stanford. And all of my working class parents' savings were being spent on my college tuition. After 6 months, I couldn't see the value in it. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, and no idea how college was going to help me figure it out. And here I was, spending all of the money my parents had saved their entire life. So I decided to drop out and trust that it would all work out okay. It was pretty scary at the time, but looking back, it was one of the best decisions I ever made. The minute I dropped out, I could stop taking the required classes that didn't interest me and begin dropping in on the ones that looked far more interesting. It wasn't all romantic. I didn't have a dorm room, so I slept on the floor in friends' rooms. I returned Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposits to buy food with. And I would walk the 7 miles across town every Sunday night to get one good meal a week at the Hare Krishna temple. I loved it. And much of what I stumbled into by following my curiosity and intuition turned out to be priceless later on. Let me give you one example. Reed College at that time offered perhaps the best calligraphy instruction in the country. Throughout the campus, every poster, every label on every drawer was beautifully hand calligraphed. Because I had dropped out and didn't have to take the normal classes, I decided to take a calligraphy class to learn how to do this. I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle in a way that science can't capture, and I found it fascinating. None of this had even a hope of any practical application in my life. But 10 years later, when we were designing the first Macintosh computer, it all came back to me. And we designed it all into the Mac. It was the first computer with beautiful typography. If I had never dropped in on that single course in college, the Mac would have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts. And since Windows just copied the Mac, it's likely that no personal computer would have them. If I had never dropped out, I would have never dropped in on that calligraphy class, and personal computers might not have the wonderful typography that they do. Of course, it was impossible to connect the dots looking forward when I was in college, but it was very, very clear looking backwards 10 years later. Again, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever. Because believing that the dots will connect down the road will give you the confidence to follow your heart, even when it leads you off the well-worn path. And that will make all the difference.